Hello everyone. Today I was looking through some magazines that I have around, and I saw a very interesting article in Amit Living about the controversy about vaccines, giving children vaccines. So some parents do not want to give their children vaccines. And this is a very interesting article. This is showing about a woman that decided not to give her children vaccines, and against the will of the government at the time. They told her that she must give her children vaccines. If she didn't give her child a vaccine, they would take the child away, and so she and her husband fought to not give her child a vaccine, as she thought it was unhealthy. And this is a good story about how she won, and she paved the way for other parents. If they decide not to give their child a vaccine, they have a precedent now, a legal precedent that they do not have to give their child a vaccine. And this is a woman that's a proponent of very healthful living, very healthy living, fresh fruits and vegetables. She has always given her children, and she's also says that the children have to have a good night's sleep. People have to sleep. They cannot at all hours of the time, at all hours of the night, be up. So anyway, let's take a look, and be eating right. And let's take a look at the article. It's from the Amit Living, Mrs.Chana Silber versus the medical establishment. The woman who fought forced vaccines. This is from the January 19th, 2011, Amit Living. Mrs.Chana Silber versus the medical establishment. The woman who fought forced vaccinations. Let's take a look at this. Very interesting article. We're almost there. We're almost there. From the courtroom to the backyard garden. How one woman battled the medical establishment and won. A personal interview with Mrs. Chana Silber by Baila Weinbereg. I have known and admired the Silber family for years. When I was growing up, the Silbers lived a few blocks away from my childhood home, and their beautiful, well-tended garden, flowers and vegetables of every sort, never ceased to fascinate me. I knew the Silbers were health-minded, as the girls my age brought the most delicious whole-grain snacks and luscious fruits to school. The Silber children were exceptionally hardy and resilient, never having visited the pediatrician or tasted medication. Their wholesome diets and authentic value systems were widely admired and respected. The Silbers, then and now, are known for their honesty and straight talk. They don't float with the current or kowtow to the latest fads. Like the pink salmon, they swim upstream, against the tide, secure in their beliefs. Nowadays, their way of life has quite a following, especially in the Monsey community, where natural diets and back-to-basics lifestyles has become very accepted. I always knew that the Silbers were opposed to vaccinations, which in those days, when the medical establishment was very powerful, was unique. What I didn't know was that the Silbers' opposition to vaccinations ended up in court in a widely publicized lawsuit, the first of its kind. The Rockland County Social Services had threatened to take their son away, threatening them with child abuse charges unless they agreed to have him vaccinated. Never once to back away from a challenge, the Silbers went to court, where their lawyer, James Fillenbaum, proved that forcing them to vaccinate their child was discriminating against their religious beliefs. The local county abruptly withdrew from the case, and the Silbers were allowed to raise their children as they saw fit. This landmark ruling paved the way for thousands of other parents who were concerned about vaccinations. Nowadays, it is very easy to receive an exemption from vaccinations for religious purposes. All one has to do is fill out a form thanks to Mrs. Silber's tenacity. Devoted parents are no longer forced to sacrifice their ideals on the altar of political correctness. The wake-up call. My interview with Mrs. Silber on a snowy Sunday evening was an eye-opener in so many ways. Mrs. Silber still resides in the humble high ranch where she raised her children. They first moved to Muncie from Brooklyn in the early 1970s. In those days, Muncie was little more than a pastoral village, nestled in the middle of acres of farmland. There were few groceries or reliable bus transportation to the city. It was like being plunked in the middle of nowhere. Quote, when I moved to Muncie, I wasn't especially health-minded, Mrs. Silber recalled. It all started when my mother, Aleh Shalom, Mrs. Mendlowitz, Aleh Shalom means of blessed memory, was diagnosed with cancer in her 70s. The doctors wanted to start her on chemotherapy, but that didn't sit well with me. She was no longer young and too frail to be exposed to such harsh chemicals. I wanted them to let her live in peace without poisoning her body. Chemotherapy often provides only short-lived respite, and then the disease returns with a vengeance. The Gertner family, who sell goat's milk, lived across from the Silbers. Quote, Mrs. Gertner fed her family a natural diet, which I had never witnessed before. Mrs. Silber explained, quote, it was the first time I saw children eating whole grain bread and unprocessed foods. The more I saw, the more impressed I was. I began to do research, and my eyes were opened to a whole new world. Mrs. Silber was also influenced by Mrs. Ruth Crane, Aleh Shalom, A.H., known as Tante Ruth, Aunt Ruth, whose healthy, natural way of life was legendary. Medical secrets. What began as a quest to help her ailing mother mushroomed into a complete way of life. Mrs. Silber was introduced via books and phone conversations to respected doctors who had become frustrated with the medical establishment and their inability to cure so many illnesses. They spoke of experiments that were manipulated to get specific results and the rampant corruption out there. Quote, many of these doctors shared their secrets, things the mainstream medical field won't tell you, and when you think about it, they made so much sense. Just stuffing your children with medicine when they are sick, for example, does it really work? How many times do you see a kid with an ear infection, finishing one bottle of antibiotic after another, with no end in sight? Each time you have to raise the dosage, but it only creates additional resistance and suppresses the immune system. Antibiotics have their place during serious illnesses, but they are overused and abused in our generation. Quote, it's like dealing with a garbage can full of flies by killing the flies, she continued. What will you accomplish? The garbage will still be there, and the next day you'll get more flies. What then is the solution for an ear infection, I ask? Garlic drops? Natural remedies? Mrs. Silber waves her hand. It's an entire way of life, a new method of thinking. When a child gets sick, be it an ear infection, a cold, or a strep throat, it's only a symptom. It's a sign that something's out of sync. If you feed your children the proper foods and live a healthy lifestyle, these childhood illnesses usually will disappear on their own. Many illnesses today are caused by overeating, especially the wrong kinds of foods. Quote, we fill our bodies with too much protein and trans fats, which create toxicity, causing many common ailments. Then we get sick. We take antibiotics and other medications, which only suppress the toxicity instead of healing. Many of these medications are addictive and cause more problems than they claim to cure. We don't have to heal our bodies. That's a fallacy. The body has the intelligence to heal itself. It's one of the Ribono Shel Olam's wonders. When you break a bone, does the doctor cure it? Of course not. The doctor sets it with a cast and waits for the bone to grow together. Quote, another example. If you get a small cut on your finger, do you run to a doctor to sew it up? That's foolish. You keep the wound clean and dry, and it heals on its own. Of course, if you irritate the wound, it will remain raw. The same applies to strep or ear infections. The body will heal itself in due time. If given the chance. Olam Chesed Yiboneh. Our Creator has bestowed upon us a world of Chesed. Chesed means loving kindness. Our Creator has bestowed upon us a world of Chesed. Quote, our job is to keep our bodies healthy and let them do what they were designed to do on their own. And if we do get sick, we have to make a cheshbon hanefesh. Cheshbon hanefesh means to take stock of what we do, the things that we do, and see what we're doing wrong and to try to correct it. So if we do get sick, we have to make a cheshbon hanefesh. What caused this illness? What am I doing wrong? How can I treat my body properly so that I can feel better again? It's a matter of cause and effect. So you discourage the use of Tylenol, for example, to knock down a fever, I ask? Quote, knocking down a fever, unless it's very high, is counterproductive. In my generation, doctors thought that fever was a dangerous thing. Today, they admit that fever is healthy. It's a chesed from the Borei Olam to alert us that something is wrong. It's a loving kindness from the Creator to alert us that something is wrong. In addition, it's the body's way of burning up the infection and making the germs go away. When you have a fever, instead of knocking it down, the best thing to do is to fast and drink lots of water, and of course, get plenty of rest. You will allow your body to use the energy it would have used to digest your food to heal you. So in other words, don't eat meals at that point, heavy meals. You should fast and drink lots of water or tea. Let me tell you a story. Quote, let me tell you a story. When one of my sons, who was married with a large family, Baruch Hashem, was about 9 years old, he had a craving for nash. He had a craving for snacks. Although I made sure to give him healthy food, he would eat the nash in cheder. He would eat this in the Hebrew school. Sure enough, he came up with a bad case of impetigo. Quote, one of the alternative healers I was talking to at the time wanted me not to give him antibiotic ointment, which would only suppress the symptom. Quote, impetigo isn't a disease. It's a sign that something is wrong in the body, she stressed. I sent my son to cheder, but the Rebbe insisted that he couldn't come with an infection which was very contagious. Since it was hard to keep him home because he had so much energy, I applied vaccination. Within a day, it disappeared. Baruch Hashem. So the interviewer is saying, thank God. In other words, that's a very good thing. So, quote, it wasn't a good thing at all, Mrs. Silber clarified. Quote, the alternative healer was appalled. Quote, you just suppressed the infection that is supposed to come out of his body, pushing it back inside. Now it will come out another way. Sure enough, a few weeks later, he had a terrible ear infection with pus draining out of his ear. Although he was in terrible pain, I didn't give him antibiotics. Instead, I made him fast for 3 days, drinking instead of eating, to cleanse the toxins from his body, and soothed his ear with warm compresses. Within a few days, the infection was gone. He is in his early 30s and has not had another ear infection since. What did his doctor say? Doctor? What doctor? Since we changed our lifestyle, my children never saw a doctor. There was no need to. The real cure. Mrs. Silber explained that most devoted parents don't realize that by giving, quote, quick cures to common illnesses, they are actually harming their child. If you cover up the symptoms, you are masking the warning. If you cover up the symptoms, you are masking the warning signs that something is wrong. Instead, focus on what your child is eating. Is he or she sleeping enough, getting enough exercise? Is there any stress in their life? Quote, today's mothers don't even realize what they are doing wrong. This bubby and elder bubby of a large family stress. This grandmother and great-grandmother of a large family stressed. Quote, they take their newborn infants out, leaving them by babysitters where they are exposed to so many germs before their immune systems are developed. Then their child gets sick and they take him to the doctor who stoops him with medicine, who puts a lot of medicine. The poor child is only a few months old, and already his mother is destroying his immune system, although she doesn't know it. Quote, so the question is, what should these mothers do if they're forced to work? Don't get me started on working mothers, Mrs. Silber said. In our days, we didn't know of such a concept. Motherhood filled us up. It was a full-time job. We were home for our children, ready to greet them when they came home from school. We cooked and baked and cleaned the house on our own, without help. And we also sewed our children's clothing. I nodded, recalling my own bubby's lifestyle, her own grandmother's lifestyle. Now let's go on to the case of Rockland County versus Moses and Chana Silber. Our conversation shifts to the fascinating story of the Silber court case. After I sheepishly confessed to vaccinating all my children, Mrs. Silber explains that most of her children were vaccinated. Quote, before I learned about the dangers of vaccination, I did what everyone else did. I listened to the doctor. I didn't realize what the medical establishment was hiding. When one of the Silber's younger children entered the school, they decided not to vaccinate him. Quote, I had no idea what a storm I was creating, Mrs. Silber recalled. The school nurse was appalled. She involved the Department of Social Services, and they threatened to take the child away. Mrs. Silber contacted Dr. Robert Mendelsohn, whose groundbreaking research into a holistic way of life has been an inspiration to millions. Dr. Mendelsohn, now deceased, helped them hire a prominent lawyer, James Fillenbaum. Fillenbaum argued that forcing them to vaccinate their child was a violation of their religious beliefs. A summary of the legal brief follows. Since 1983, there have been a series of decisions by federal district and appellate courts which have clearly established the rights of parents to have their children exempted from receiving immunization based upon their religious beliefs. So the rights have been established to exempt their children from receiving immunization. A New York attorney, James Fillenbaum, has won almost every religious exemption case he has fought in his state. According to Fillenbaum, quote, the right to claim exemption from immunization based on religious beliefs is available to all persons who hold religious beliefs against immunization. Fillenbaum's first case, 1982-83, an Orthodox Jewish family. Fillenbaum's first case is now known as Rockland County, New York versus Moses and Chana Silber case. This case was reported extensively in the media, but was not covered in law journals. This case ended in the middle of the trial when the county abruptly withdrew their charges against the Silbers, and the case was dismissed. The Silbers had refused to have their youngest child vaccinated because they had come to believe that the immunization could possibly injure Abraham. Fillenbaum said, tragically, both Moses and Chana Silber were now being threatened by U.S. government officials as they had been when they were children in Nazi Germany. Both parents were survivors of the Holocaust. Now, 40 years later, the local government was threatening to take their child away from them because of their religious beliefs. The proceeding was brought against the Silbers, charging them with, quote, neglect for failing to immunize Abraham. Dr. Robert Mendelsohn, then president of the National Health Foundation, testified as to the dangers and the risks of immunization. He testified specifically that there are more causes of polio induced by immunization than would occur otherwise. In the subsequent federal court action of Silber versus Rockland County, money damages were recovered by Fillenbaum for the wrongful prosecution of the Silbers by the county. Quote, I didn't realize what a sensation the court case would become, Mrs. Silber said, ruefully, shaking her head. Quote, my baby was only a few weeks old and we had to go to court for the trial, which dragged on for hours. The media had a field day with our story. This was the first time parents had successfully challenged the medical establishment regarding vaccinations. Nowadays, of course, it's much easier. Parents can get an exemption for either medical or religious reasons. So now parents can get an exemption for either medical or religious reasons. So if one has medical protests against having their child vaccinated or religious protest, one can get an exemption. How did it feel to win? It was a very good feeling to know that other parents won't have to go through what we did. Nowadays, none of my children vaccinate their children, and they aren't given a hard time about it either. We paved the way for others to follow. The Silbers didn't relish the media attention and had no desire to make their values into a cause célèbre. It was simply a matter of standing up for their beliefs and doing what they felt was the right thing for their family. Baking their own bread, buying raw honey directly from the manufacturers, shunning sugar, margarine, and processed food was all an outgrowth of their value system. Let's take a look at the Silber diet. The Silber diet. So, tell me a bit about the type of foods your family ate. How do they differ from the typical diet? In response, Mrs. Silber gives me a tour of her store, The Natural Place. She has a store called The Natural Place, located in her garage. I inhale the sweet scent of dried fruits as I gaze at the shelves filled with fresh, from the farm abundance. Here, taste this. She hands me a large, luscious date. I make a bracha and bite in. That means she makes a blessing. I make a bracha and bite in. The soft, heavenly sweetness makes me feel as if I am tasting one of the Shivas Haminim from a bygone era. I admire a handful of fresh roasted nuts grown without pesticides from pure seeds and observe a bottle of freshly squeezed virgin olive oil shipped from the owner of the olive trees. Quote, I order all these foods straight from the farms without a middleman, Mrs. Silber explains. The floor is stacked with barrels of pure raw honey, which is used instead of sugar. One barrel, which costs $250, is enough to last for a year. I gratefully accept a packet of dried mangoes whose natural sweetness and powerful aroma puts the standard supermarket dried fruit to shame. Is everything here organic? I naively ask. Mrs. Silber dismissed the word organic with a wave of her hand. Today, even organic fruits and vegetables are grown commercially. They don't come close to the real thing. It's important to eat fruits, but only in moderation when they are in season. Eating watermelon in the winter isn't the way Hashem intended us to be nourished. Cooling summer fruits should be consumed when they naturally grow, and warm soups made with root vegetables are perfect for the winter. There are plenty of produce available to eat all year around. You don't need to resort to vitamins to get your nourishment.
That's Harry Edison. Harry lived in an apartment building under the wing of Los Angeles.
So let's continue on to a different.
He traveled so much. Musicians are so nomadic. Obviously, they have to be. But he made it an easy trip to the airport. He told me that himself. In 1995, backstage at Carnegie Hall, there was a concert building honoring Sinatra.
Passing it down, the talk shifts to Mrs. Silber's children, all married and raising their own families. Quote, one of my daughters recently made her own bread using homemade sourdough. Every one of my children has embraced the natural lifestyle. Some more than others, of course, but they all thank me for teaching them the right values. Quote, what did you serve them as they were growing up? Was it hard to prepare all natural meals? Not at all. I made life simple by serving basic whole foods. Some mothers think you need all 4 food groups at every meal. That's nonsense. In our home, we would have fresh whole grain bread or rolls for breakfast with fresh fruits and vegetables. The children would snack on dried fruits or roasted nuts. Delicious. For supper in the summer, I would sometimes serve fresh corn from Van Ripper's farm along with whole grain bread. In the winter, I usually prepared a steaming pot of vegetable soup to warm the body and soul. I guarantee you, our children never went hungry. The wholesome, healthy food filled them up without giving them a sugar high. Today's children eat so much refined sugar. Did you know that there is an epidemic of diabetes today? Even little children are diagnosed with the disease. And allergies? Who heard of allergies in our generation? We didn't have these issues. So, what's the solution? Instead of feeding our kids refined food filled with chemicals and sweeteners, cut up some fruits and vegetables. Bake your own cakes and cookies using natural ingredients. Children naturally crave healthy food. It's our fault that they are addicted to sugar and sweet garbage because we feed it to them. I couldn't agree more. Yet the reality is we're so strapped for time. Who can afford the luxury of baking their own bread? Once again, Mrs. Silber is quick to remind me that we have lost sight of our priorities. If we won't be so busy shopping, filling our children's closet with matching clothes, maybe we'd have more time to feed them well and nourish their souls. A child whose body is filled with chemicals can't learn properly. Their brains are not able to concentrate. Take the sugar out of their diets and you'll see a remarkable difference. Another pet peeve of Mrs. Silber is our generation's habit of, quote, burning the midnight oil and working late hours, depriving our bodies of their physical need to rest. In the previous generations, when the world became dark, people lit a candle. When it burned out, they went to sleep. Today, we have lights on 24/7, pushing our bodies beyond their physical capabilities. We are not giving ourselves a chance to rejuvenate. Is it any wonder that we become sick? How much sleep does an average person need a night? Between 6 to 8 hours minimum. If you eat healthy foods and exercise, you'll need less sleep.